appears to be on the screen. Let me go to gallery. Okay. Right. Yes, for those of you who haven't come across me, my name, as you can see from the screen, is Monica Bohm-Duchen. I was the person, I'm an art historian, but perhaps as importantly, the daughter of two former refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe who made it here just, but really in the case of my mother, just in time. But it was my, what to say really, sort of brainchild, some 3 years ago now, to initiate and then become the director of a nationwide year-long arts festival designed to celebrate the immense contribution, so often commented on but rarely scrutinized, of those who came from Nazi Europe to this country and for the most part made this country their home, with a great deal of gratitude thrown in, of course. Now, as you may know, some of you will have seen the website. If you aren't familiar with it, please do have a good look. It lasted from March 2019 through to March 2020, when the last 2 weeks or so were rather rudely curtailed, truncated by the you-know-what, I don't have to say what happened in the middle of March. Some of those events, incidentally, will be rescheduled, so keep looking out for them if you were interested in those particular ones. But it's been, as my father used to say, a blessing in disguise, quite unexpectedly, that this current lockdown situation has forced so many of us to think differently about the way in which we communicate to others. And it occurred to me only a few weeks ago, really, in discussion with others involved with Refugee Week, that it was ironically the perfect opportunity to open up the dialogue, the conversation, the discussion about that refugee contribution to a much wider audience, which of course transcends geographical boundaries. I'm hoping that even now there may be people listening in from faraway countries that wouldn't normally be able to attend in person. So in other words, it has unexpectedly provided a wonderful kind of new lease of life to the Insiders Outsiders Festival, that we can now put on this program of events for Refugee Week. It seems so entirely apposite, but also please keep a lookout. We are planning other things for the future, into the summer and possibly beyond. This is only the beginning. I would like to thank the Association of Jewish Refugees very warmly, and Alex Moores is the person to whom you should address any questions you may have at the end of these presentations on the chat, through the chat option. But the AJR, much to my delight, agreed to partner the Insiders Outsiders Festival on this series of events this week, and I'm very grateful to them. For anybody who doesn't know much about that wonderful institution, I would very much recommend that you look at their website. And indeed, Bea Lefkowitz in the previous session was talking about a brand new and very relevant project, a kind of microsite, as you've called it, looking, kind of distilling from the Refugee Voices archive, apposite excerpts to do with the internment experience. I do urge you to look at that. A few very practical issues. Some of you will be old hands when it comes to Zoom, but let me just run through them. As you will have been aware, most of you, well, all of you are now muted to prevent any background interference. When it comes to an element of interaction at the end, you will be unmuted. If we get to that, we'll see how that goes, but that's the general idea. As I've already mentioned, I think probably the most efficient way of asking those questions is indeed to just type them in a condensed form and address them through the chat option to Alex Moores, who will be looking out for them. All the events this week are being automatically recorded. If you don't wish to see yourself recorded, then simply turn off the video logo. Yes, turn it off and you will be invisible again. What else? I think that's probably enough by way of practicalities. We're talking about Warth Mills. Let me just go to speaker. No, hold on, why is Caroline Munns coming up on speaker view? I don't know. Go back to this so I can see most of you. It is, as many of you will already be aware, it is almost to the day, certainly to the month, it is the 80th anniversary of the, what can I say, morally murky, historically exceedingly complex, problematic internment episode. To this day, and I'm sure the participants in the session to come will agree with me, it's still an episode of British wartime history, British history full stop, I think, which is insufficiently known and insufficiently explored. And the particular camp, the transit camp that we're going to be scrutinizing today, is particularly unknown, and I won't say too much more about that. I'd heard of it as somebody who had a specialist interest in the internment of so-called enemy aliens in 1940. I'd heard of it, knew really only one very important fact, and that is that it was notorious for being insalubrious, unsalubrious, I'm not quite sure what the correct adjective is, but it was one of the most inhygienic, the most shameful of the camps in terms of the practical conditions. And then lo and behold, I discover that a Manchester-based filmmaker, who I will introduce properly very shortly, Richard Shaw, who again very personally I first met because he came to my family some while earlier wanting to make a film, which he duly did, about my wonderful photographer mother, Dorothy Bohm, which is going to be screened next Sunday for those of you who are interested. It's again on the Insiders Outsiders website in association with Four Corners. But Richard Shaw, lo and behold, by pure coincidence, as a Mancunian, became interested, he'll tell you much more, but he initiated this wonderful project called the Warth Mills Project. And well, it seemed to me that this week is a perfect opportunity to talk about all this further. But I'm going to hand over, first of all, to a historian, Dr. Rachel Pistol, to set the wider scene. And then I will turn to Richard, and then to a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Anna Nyburg, who's a historian, an art historian, who will be focusing in on one particular artist internee. So we'll go, I think there's a certain logic here, we'll go from the very general and the contextual to the quite specific in terms of Warth Mills itself, to the very specific, namely the scrutinizing of the experiences of one particular artist who was interned there. Let me start then by introducing Rachel, if I may. She's a research fellow at King's College London, KCL, on the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. In December 2019, her co-edited collection entitled The Jews, the Holocaust and the Public, The Legacies of David Cesarani, and I'm sure most of you will know that he died far too young, far too soon. This is a homage to him, was published by Palgrave Macmillan. Rachel's published widely on the Second World War internment, not just in the UK, but also in the USA. And while that isn't our main focus today, it was mentioned also by Bea in the previous episode that, of course, there were internment camps elsewhere in the world, and that's something to be acknowledged. She's discussed Second World War internment on BBC TV and radio and Sky News, and written many articles comparing internment with modern day issues that have appeared in Newsweek, The Independent and the Huffington Post. And I'll hand over to Rachel in a minute, but I'm glad you mentioned that in the blurb that you gave to me, Rachel, to read out, because making those links between past and present, stressing the relevance of the historical to the contemporary is, of course, at the very heart of what I'm hoping we can do here. Thank you very much. Over to Rachel.
Thank you, Monica, and thanks to Insiders, Outsiders and the AJR for organising this event. I do I recognise many faces, and also I recognise many faces from the previous talk as well. Obviously Tony and Bea did a fantastic job of giving you an overview and setting the scene. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to sort of give you a bit more focused information on the early part of what happened with refugees and enemy aliens, sort of at the beginning part of the war. So so I know some of you weren't at that talk, so I'll just do a quick recap over the fact that Britain had done mass internment in the First World War of all German males, and then expelled them at the end of the war. And they were aware very much in 1939 that the majority of enemy aliens were actually friendly and supportive to the Allied war effort. So they didn't want to do mass internment. They really went to great lengths to try not to do that. And so they instituted tribunals. And these tribunals were set up around the country and run with, they were run by magistrates, and they had various different people who sat on each of these committees, and they were quite different in their approaches. So sometimes they were very sympathetic to refugees, sometimes they were very unsympathetic to refugees, and there's quite a diversity of use of classification. But the three classifications that were used at the time was a classification of A, which was where you were considered to be an immediate threat to the country and to national security, and therefore were interned immediately. And we're talking about sort of around 600 people that applied for, mostly men. And then there was the B category, which was if the tribunal wasn't 100% sure. They didn't feel that they were an immediate threat, but equally they weren't 100% sure they were maybe a refugee, or they just wanted extra extra conditions imposed on the aliens, so you couldn't travel within outside a certain radius of your home. You had to report to the police every week. You couldn't own radios and cameras and things like that. And then C, which is what most of the enemy aliens were categorized as, which were genuine refugees from Nazi oppression. So theoretically, anyone who was sort of the biggest danger to national security had been locked up, but it was very irregularly applied, and there were a lot of issues with that. I'm just going to share my, I'm not going to share my screen with you, Monica.
Why not?
You haven't given me permission, but that's okay, because I have...
Alex, I think you can do so. Alex?
He's nodding.
Yeah, I think he's going to do something that will make it possible.
Okay, well, I will talk to you about tribunals.
Give it a try now, Rachel.
Oh, thank you very much, Alex. I can indeed do that. Perfect. So, I wanted to share with you a nice little quote. Here we go. So, this actually was a petition of B-class aliens who were they were on the Isle of Man, and they wrote this when they were in Onken camp. And I think what's quite interesting to note here is that category B was used for a variety of purposes, but one of the main purposes was for any enemy alien who was self-employed. So if you ran your own company, because they kind of felt that maybe they couldn't run the same level of checks on you as they'd be able to do if you're employed elsewhere, you were automatically considered to be a B. And so you can see this quote here from the petition about it is an excellent idea in principle, but the way it was done was somewhat erratic. Mark Linton, he was a young internee at the time, and he describes his tribunal as being a somewhat Colonel Blimp affair, where he went in and was asked what school he was attending, and they liked that, and he'd liked playing rugby, and he liked playing rugby, and they decided based on this that he was a genuine refugee from Nazi oppression. And he said afterwards, quote, "It should perhaps have occurred to me then that a screening process that would theoretically have allowed me to have long telephone chats with Hitler that very night might create problems at some later stage." And of course, at some later stage, it did, because although people were allowed to live mostly at liberty after having the tribunals took place between September and November 1939. And then you find that there's a big swing in public opinion by the time we get to the fall of France and the Low Countries in May 1940. And there's very much a panic and pressure move to go into mass internment. And the key dates for this are, you've got several different waves. They go through May, June, and then later in June, even they go in separate waves. So you have some people being arrested into July as well, depending on how the local police organise that. So once everyone's arrested, if you're a woman who is arrested early on, you're sent to Holloway Prison. If you're a man who's arrested early on, and I would just move across to share this with you. So this is something that I'm working on at the moment in terms of collating the data from all the different sort of major transit camps. So what would happen is once a person was arrested, they'd be held in their local police station for between a few hours and a few days, and then they'd be moved to a sort of centralized holding point. And these were all sorts of different places. So these orange ones that you can see on the screen, they are the earliest transit camps, and they were holiday camps. So think classic Butlins, Heidi High type holiday camps. And so you've got Clacton-on-Sea, and you've got Seaton and Paignton down in the southwest as well. And these are camps, again, which much like Warth Mills, very little sort of known about some of these camps. So if you're a woman, the primary place is this pink one, which is Holloway Prison, and you were separated from your children if there was no one else to look after your children. So some children were taken into care temporarily until they could be reunited. If you were a woman who was a B category and arrested later on, then you would actually be able to travel with your children, and you'd be taken to unused schools, unused hospitals, and places like that generally before you were moved on to the Isle of Man. If you're a man, you could be moved across many of these different camps around the country. So I'm just going to swap into there. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Paignton and Seaton, for example. So the primary difference here is this: it's very interesting how this is done, because you think we're only dealing with if we're talking between the tribunal, say sort of September 1939 to the calls for mass internment that start in May 1940. At that point, you've only got around 600 men who are interned. And here are some pictures which are contemporary of the time. Obviously, the postcard does not show internees, it shows holiday makers. But just to give you some sort of idea what you've got, you've also, in addition to those 600 men, you also have merchant seamen. And the other thing that's very important to remember with this is that the people who are categorised A tends to be either very strong fascists, very strong communists, or trade unionists. So you have a real conflict of ideology and beliefs and in the camps, and this becomes very difficult because obviously the camps varied depending on whether there's a majority of Nazis in the camp or whether there are a majority of communists in the camp. In Seaton, they came to an uneasy truce where on one side of the swimming pool were the fascists, on the other side of the swimming pool were the communists, and for those who weren't 100% sure which side they belonged to, they pitched tents in between the two rows of huts. Now Paignton, which is the bottom right-hand corner there, was the luxury camp where you could actually pay to be waited on and have your own accommodation and receive better food and other privileges like that. So long as you could afford 4 shillings and 6 pence a day, then you could stay in Paignton. As soon as you ran out of money, you'd be moved to Seaton. And as I'm sure you can imagine, these holiday camps, they're very basic, and they're set up for summer weather. And of course, these internees are interned over the winter, and it was one of the worst winters on record in terms of weather and the snow. I mean, Seaton is very close to the sea, that particular site, and it's flooded. Whenever there is a particularly bad storm, then the camp would be flooded. Even though the internees were given 4 blankets, that was not nearly enough to keep them warm. And at one point they did actually, the army did actually bring in heating elements for the huts, which lasted until the first electricity bill arrived. And then they realised how expensive it was actually heating the men's huts, so they tried to confiscate all of the heating elements that they'd given out. But the internees were far too clever for that and found out some very ingenious ways of hiding them so that they wouldn't get confiscated and so that they wouldn't freeze. And I think that is a theme that very much comes through all of the internment diaries and memoirs and interviews you have is some of the accounts are recounted sort of tongue in cheek, because it was a very traumatic time. It was a very distressing time. The worst part of internment was in these early days when it was very much a panic response and nothing was fully established. Things weren't properly set up, records weren't properly kept. Nazis were housed with Jews, and nobody knew what was going to happen, whether Germany was going to actually invade successfully and these internees were going to be trapped and then sent back to Germany. So this is the most stressful part of internment at these early days. And of course, internees are trying to navigate their new life behind barbed wire. They're trying to find ways to be released. They are trying to figure out what's going on with their different family members as well. And a fantastic source of some of these early camps is actually some reports by Quakers. The Quakers went into all of the transit camps and offered reports on the living conditions. I'm just going to read out a couple of quotes from some of the camps if I swap back onto the map of the transit camps. Some of the descriptions from the earliest camps show how bad these are, especially in comparison with what they later get in the Isle of Man, which the quality of accommodation is much better there. But if we talk first of all about very quickly the women's experience in Holloway Prison, for example, the Austrian writer Elisabeth von Janstein remembered the humiliating admission procedure, the initial solitary confinement, the lack of clean clothing, the uncomfortable prison bed, the screams emanating from adjacent cells, and the uncertainty and the fear. If we travel across to some of the men's camps from outside, we've got Ascot, Kempton, Lingfield. We have Stephen Vajda describing Lingfield as saying, "The food was army style, basic but adequate, dealt out from mobile food trailers. I could not help but reflect on my arrest in Gießen and subsequent transport to Buchenwald 18 months earlier, and the difference between the horror then and the gentlemanly procedure now. I personally, unlike some others, quite understood the motive for internment, but deplored the mindless, ignorant reaction and lack of knowledge and judgment of officialdom by depriving the country of valuable skilled labour for the war effort." Kempton Park, a police van, this is Kurt Frankensfeld, a police van took us to Kempton Park Racecourse, where a grenadier guard gave us an unfriendly reception. We were shouted at, forced to queue up, searched. We had to give up our papers, money, lighters, knives, razor blades. Then we had to queue up once more for blankets and a mattress, tin bowl and plate. We were to spend the night with 500 others on the concrete floor of a big hall. In the evening, someone poured tea into our bowls and put 2 slices of bread on the plate. I found myself in the middle of a mass of unhappy people. I was overwhelmed by the unexpected and sudden separation from my wife and my work, and deeply angered by the wrong which I felt had been done to me. But again, it tends to be the very worst description to come from the very beginning of internment, and then after a period of adjustment, like one of the internees, H. Enoch, he says, apart from the quantitatively and qualitatively very poor food, Kempton Park was quite good for my health in view of the good quarter and lovely warm summer weather. So he was interned as we were getting into the summer. Psychologically, however, the separation from my mother and the withholding of any news of her and the war was very tormenting. And also, there's so much more I could tell you about this, but we are somewhat limited in time. But the camps were so rudimentary. I mean, we're talking about using the disused quarters of the circus over in Ascot. We're talking about tents in fields with barbed wire quickly put up around them. We're talking about holiday camps. We're talking about racetracks, race courses, unused schools, sometimes prisons. These are all temporary until the accommodation on the Isle of Man can be sorted out and the camps can be made there so everyone can be transferred across or transported abroad. The major camp before sort of coming across to the Isle of Man was an unfinished housing estate called Huyton, called Wolfell Heath, just in Huyton outside of Liverpool. And this was sort of the luxury camp in terms of transit camps, because it was an unfinished housing estate. And as things slowly improved in the camp, for example, men over 60 were given a bedstead instead of having to sleep on straw-filled mattresses. They were given some furniture for the houses. As Kurt Frankenschwert again says, we could sometimes go for a walk outside the camp, accompanied by a few soldiers and a sergeant. We had entertainments and concerts. An art exhibition was arranged, at which the excellent camp commander delivered a remarkable speech full of understanding and encouragement. But all this did not take away the feeling of captivity. But you start to see with Huyton, because it's a larger camp and it's in existence for slightly longer than some of these other camps, that actually some of these things that you start to see in the other internment camps in Canada, Australia and the Isle of Man, such as the art exhibitions and the cabaret and etc., and the popular universities start to be there. But I'm just, before we hand over to Richard, I'm just going to give a couple of descriptions. Now you've heard a little bit about some of the other transit camps. I'm just going to give you a couple of descriptions of Warth Mills. So as one internee remembered, the rooms were dark, even in those sunny days of July, the floors soaked with the oil which for years had dripped from the looms, the staircases with an open lift shaft were very narrow, the corridors even narrower and damp. In case a fire was started by an incendiary bomb, not a single man would have escaped, and had a person forced his way into the open air, the space between the walls and the barbed wire would have been far too small. The hygienic accommodation was of a highly objectionable primitiveness. On the premises were, for about 2,000 people, 60 WCs, a euphemism, for there were just buckets spreading a terrific stench and no water flushing system. And so you will see as these discussions continue just how terrible Warth Mills was in comparison with the other camps. And it's also just important to note, so that these transit camps were in use from the time that sort of mass internment starts coming with them. Apart from the first three, the build-up in transit camps come from the point that the B-class internees and then the C category internees are all interned. And many of the internees who were sent to Warth Mills went on the Arundel Star, which was tragically torpedoed and sunk on its way to Canada on the 2nd of July, which again, we're coming up to the 80th anniversary of that too. And those who survived were then sent on the Dunera. So from Warth Mills, the trajectory onwards, I mean, this was the bleakest point of internment, really, sort of around Warth Mills and the Arundel Star. And these internees either ended up, on the Arundel Star, the Dunera, or the Isle of Man. So I will leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. I think we'll leave questions till the end. I think that's probably the best strategy. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Richard Shaw. Let me say a little bit about him. As I have already indicated, he's a Manchester-based filmmaker and project manager. And in 2017-18, he initiated and then was really the mastermind behind the Warth Mills project, which you can easily find online by simply doing a Google search. Generously supported, I have to say, by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It told the story of Warth Mills not only through a fantastic website, which is still very much up and running, but also through a locally held exhibition and various other publications and public events, including those involving contemporary refugees, which again I think is important to mention. As a filmmaker, Richard has made countless short films for a whole variety of museums and galleries, and more recently 2 longer films, one of which I've already mentioned, both in fact for Sky Arts, one called Seeing Daylight, the photography of Dorothy Bohm, just to repeat, being screened on this coming Sunday at 6:30, and most recently The Animated World of Hallas and Bachelor, a wonderful pair of animation filmmakers. And I'm currently in discussion, just so I can mention this, with the Hungarian Cultural Centre in London, with a view to having a screening and Q&A about that excellent project as well. I'll also mention somebody who was mentioned in the very first session this afternoon, Ruth Borchardt. Richard told me recently that Sky Arts has actually commissioned him to do a series of short films about events, about exhibitions taking place beyond the blockbuster scene, as it were, away from London and in lesser known galleries. And one of the ones he is investigating the possibility of is an exhibition being held hopefully this autumn at the Manx National Museum on the Isle of Man in Douglas, its capital, which will be a selection of the very magnificent collection amassed by Ruth Borchardt of self-portraits by British-based artists. And just to remind you, Ruth Borchardt herself was an internee, and she's one of the very few people, and certainly one of the very few women, who actually wrote a memoir of her experiences, not alas on the Isle of Man itself, because she stopped short of that, but of her time in Holloway prison. So there's some very interesting things sort of coming together. So look out for that project. Richard, over to you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
I think so. Right, yeah.
Great. So we came to this project in around about 2017 and worked on it through to sort of the end of 2019. So we found, kind of to my surprise really, how many artists were interned at Warth Mills. And I thought to best use this time in connection with Insiders Outsiders, it'd be an idea to just introduce you to some of the artists who passed through Warth Mills. So there isn't that much information because they were there for a maximum of 4 weeks. And there isn't that much information about the lives that people were leading there, other than, as Rachel says, investigations into the conditions. There's some first-hand testimonies, but it's more about really representing the artists who were there during that period and what they'd done before and what their experience was going forward, mostly onto the Isle of Man. So I'll share my screen. Fantastic. So, as I said, there are many artists that I could have chosen to discuss. So there are painters and visual artists like Jack Bilbo, musicians like Ferdinand Rauter. Some of those you can go on our website, warthmills.com, and still read profiles of them and investigate. So I try to select just a cross-section. So firstly, this is Hermann Feckenbach. So Feckenbach was an artist and printmaker who'd arrived in England with his wife Greta in 1939. He was interned, and what's really useful, that something that Feckenbach created, later on the Isle of Man, he created lino cuts, and these actually depict Warth Mills. So as you can see on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, as you're looking to it, there's all the gear that was still there from when it was a working mill. So it had been derelict for quite a few years. But this is really useful, both in terms of showing how overcrowded it was and also its past life. Feckenbach, while he was there, he was quite a militant guy and artist, and he organized a hunger strike because conditions were that bad. So even though he was there a short amount of time, he was very political and tried to engage the other internees in a hunger strike. So these are called Hunger Strike 1 and 2, these lino cuts. So really, showing how artists could immortalize the spaces they were in, and they didn't leave behind the art. It didn't rest somewhere and be something that they came back to. During internment, it was something that was very much there, as you'll see as we go forward through the different internees that we talk about. Probably the most famous, almost recognised internee who passed through Warth Mills is Kurt Schwitters. So here's Schwitters, and you can see down on the right-hand side, this is his tribunal card. So as Rachel said, initially, the refugees were sent to a tribunal, which at this point in the war, before Italy had joined, they were mostly classified as friendly aliens. That was all to change later on into 1940. Schwitters had come from, he was born in Hanover in 1887 to a middle-class family, and he developed a sort of one-person art movement that he called Merz, and it included prose, poetry, typography, painting, sculpture, collage. Because he used found objects, his work was classed as degenerate by the Nazis and included in exhibitions as the art that they did not want in post-war Germany. So with his son, Ernst, Kurt Schwitters managed to get out of Germany, initially fled to Norway, and then on an icebreaker managed to get to Edinburgh. So as I say, from there he was interned initially at York Racecourse, and then moved on to Warth Mills, where he was interned with his son Ernst for 4 weeks. A nice kind of little thing that we found in connection with Kurt and Ernst was the commander at Warth Mills was later arrested for theft, for taking possessions from internees and not returning them, basically. In one piece that I managed to find, there was a description of the case, and it mentioned that a typewriter was taken from, and the name was a very, very corrupted version of Ernst Schwitters. So Ernst actually gave evidence against Major Braybrook, who was the commander at Warth Mills, who was then found guilty and imprisoned for 18 months. Kurt Schwitters, like most of the internees, went on to the Isle of Man and was kept at Hutchinson camp, which was came to be regarded as the artists' camp. There was a combination of older established artists and young artists who came through, and one of whom I'll come to at the end. Schwitters eventually was released along with the other internees, and probably his most famous piece of work is the Merz Barn, which is in Cumbria, which was again part of his one-man exploration, and is now based in the northeast. Schwitters was granted citizenship on the 4th of January 1948, but sadly he died the next day. So yeah, there's just a couple of quotes one from Kurt Schwitters and a second from Peter Blake, showing the influence that Schwitters had on the pop artists. Great. Next up is Paul Hamann. And I think Chris Drinkwater, who is Paul Hamann's grandson, may be with us, which is really nice. And he provided a lot of the biographical information and also the archive that you're going to see. So Paul Hamann was born in Hamburg. He studied with Rodin in Paris in 1913, and then served his military service in 1914. On his return to Germany, he became a lecturer, and he pioneered a method of creating sculptures called life masks, which to me quite a frightening prospect, but he was very, very successful and created impressions of various English figures, so Aldous Huxley, Noel Coward, Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, and in this picture there's you can see him working with Man Ray to create a sculpture of Man Ray. So Paul Hamann married a Jewish lady, so therefore was on borrowed time in Germany and managed to flee, eventually arriving in England and again being interned. And at Warth Mills. Some of the archive that Chris shared were these fantastic letters. So there is at least another one on the website, but these are written to Paul's friend, George Merritt, the actor who was in London. But you can see on the right-hand side, Warth Mills internment camp, and again, opened by censor. So someone had looked at these before they got to George. I was also quite excited when Monica said the date and in relation to the 80th anniversary, because for a second I thought this was going to be exactly 80 years today, but it's not quite. It will be on the 5th of July. So next month, that letter will celebrate its 80th birthday. Paul Herman again went on to the Isle of Man and was interned on Hutchinson Camp. The image on the left, I think is Paul Herman, painted by Kurt Schwitters. I think I'm right in saying Paul Herman's wife didn't like it. She wasn't keen. I think that's right. Chris will correct me if I'm wrong. And here's Paul working on a sculpture in Hutchinson Camp, I believe, while he was interned. Paul's work after his death was bought by the National Portrait Gallery, showing what an important sculptor he was. Two more. The young guy on the right was born Hans Fritz Gellhorn, and he'd become Peter Gellhorn. So he was born in what is now Poland. It was part of Germany at that point. And he had a passion for music. Peter's father was Jewish. So he faced, as he began and he became a musical director in Berlin, he faced problems with his career and personal life. So he, using his artistic links, I guess, he managed to get out of Germany by saying he was going on holiday, which turned out not to be a holiday. So he fled through France and arrived in England. He based himself at Toynbee Hall, which is in East London, still there now. It was a kind of an artist's centre for the arts, and it taught music and directed, and he could direct performances there. And he worked with various other notable musicians. This, I think, is the flip side of the tribunal card that you saw previously. So this would have, I guess, been on the flip side, showing where he was at that point. Again, Peter ended up on the Isle of Man, and then post-internment, he had a really eminent career working with Sadler's Wells, Royal Opera House, Glyndebourne, BBC, as musical director and conductor. The final interview I wanted to talk about is Peter Midgley. So Peter was born Peter Fleischmann in Berlin in 1921. He had a really tragic start to his life. His parents were writers and ran a newspaper, a socialist newspaper, which obviously fell out of favour with the Nazi Party. And his parents died in mysterious circumstances. I think it would appear to be a road accident. So Peter grew up in an orphanage for Jewish children, but was a keen painter throughout his youth. He managed to flee Germany on the Kindertransport eventually, and arrived in England in 1938. Here's his passport. Give you a second to have a look at that. And there's actually a fantastic, if you go on our website on his page, all these internees have their own page with different bits and pieces and biographical information a map charting the journeys that were taken. On the website, you can see a Pathe newsreel, and at about 6 seconds, you can actually see Peter, which is fantastic, that he's actually holding his, presumably some of his work, and his art materials will be in the bag, I would guess. Once he arrived in England, he ended up settling with 2 artists in Manchester, and that's where he got the name Midgley. He took their name, so they looked after him. At this point, he was called to tribunal and then later arrested as an enemy alien and taken to Warth Mills. There is a really great oral history with Peter where he describes conditions at Warth Mills, and he says they were dirty and chaotic. And he also talks about, again, what's really relevant to insiders, outsiders, and what I was saying at the start. He talks about how artists would create tools out of anything that was available. So they'd turn the metal beds into scalpels and create lino cuts, and it was there throughout this internment period, and whether or not the work survived, I think they were probably all creating work. Later on, Peter ended up on the Isle of Man like the others, and it was while he was here, he was, there was kind of, the older artists almost set up a university or art college, and they tutored some of the younger artists. So Peter Midgley was one of these younger artists, and he talked about how much he learned on the Isle of Man. So as well as it being a devastating experience and not knowing what on earth was going to happen, and feeling like you're kind of sitting ducks really if the Germans invaded, they were the first to go, the people on the island. It was still a creative time even against that backdrop. So that was Peter. He joined the British Army afterwards, and interestingly, he returned to Warth Mills as an interpreter, and by that point it had become a prisoner of war camp. So he did actually come back for a period of time, and it was improved as a prisoner of war camp because prisoners of war were protected by the Geneva Convention in a way that internees were not. Conditions at that point were vastly improved. And there we have on the right-hand side a self-portrait that Peter created later on in his life. So he went on to study at the Royal College of Art, and then had various exhibitions. He displayed work at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Royal Academy, and also I think he had an exhibition in Berlin later on post-war. He went back to Berlin and exhibited his work. And interesting to note as well, and kind of really sad, his as devastating as his early experience had been, the orphanage that he grew up in, after he had left and escaped on a kinder transport, all the children in that orphanage were killed, and it was razed to the ground by the Nazis. And there's now a memorial wall there. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was fascinating and very moving as well. Before I hand over to Anna for the third part of our session today, I'd like to ask Richard a question, which I'm sure everybody else is also very curious to know the answer to. I think unlike many people listening in today, you have no, what shall I say, sort of vested family interest in this history. You are a local man who became involved with this project. Tell us, if you would, what prompted you to undertake this Warth Mills project?
I think it was because, well, I have a natural interest in history, and particularly that period of history. But I think it's because we live, Warth Mills, as I look out of this window, Warth Mills is probably about 10 minutes drive from here. And I didn't know of its existence and its history. And anyone that you talk to in Bury, if they know anything and you start engaging them in a conversation and you talk about internment, they'll straight away say, oh, you mean prisoners of war? And then each time, and there's someone else in the room, Errol, who's been working on the project, and he's probably had the same experience. He's a local man. And whenever you mention it to someone, they know it as a prisoner of war camp. They don't really recognise internment. And by extension, I think not only that they don't recognise that space in that way, they don't really know anything about internment at all. So it was a way, it was kind of a conduit really, that a way of telling a much broader story with a location that people knew and was just down the road.
Thank you. Very good. So now Anna Nyburg, Dr. Anna Nyburg, is a committee member, a long-standing member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, which is based, as some of you may know, at the University of London, does wonderful academic work. Her biography, which is pertinent to today's session, called From Leipzig to London, The Life and Work of Hellmuth Weissenborn, was published in 2012, and that will be the subject of her talk today. But she's also published several other books, one of them also extremely useful and relevant to the topic, to the theme of Insiders Outsiders, is called Émigré, The Transformation of Art Publishing in Britain, published in 2014, and much more recently, in fact only a few months old, a lovely book called The Clothes on Our Backs, How Refugees from Nazism Revitalized the British Fashion Trend. Came out just earlier this year. Her current focus is primarily on refugees in the design world, and she's also co-produced a film which I highly recommend if you have a chance to see it, called Refuge Britain, Stories of Émigré Designers, which once more focuses primarily on those from the Hitler émigré, in Daniel Soman's memorable phrase, that generation of 1930s, mostly Jewish refugees, but also includes some footage with a young Syrian, I think I've got that right, Anna, a Syrian designer working in Britain today. So again, past and present coming together. Anna, over to you. Anna, are you there?
And there we go.
There we
Hear me now?
All right, you tell me when you want me to share the screen.
Yes, I think we'll start off with the screen if we'll start straight off with your slides, please. Although if you're crafty, you will see that I have a Hellmuth Weissenborn piece behind me, but Monica's going to help share the slides. Here we go.
I'm going to get it full screen if I can. There we go, all right?
Right, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about this artist here, Hellmuth Weissenborn. And I hope in the talk it will bring together lots of the elements that you've already heard about today, especially if you heard the first talk, and indeed some of the people, because he was in the same camps as them. So Hellmuth Weissenborn, as you can see here, was born in 1898, and he was born in Leipzig. Now, he wasn't born into a Jewish family, so he had that in common with Paul Hamann, for example, or Kurt Schwitters, but nevertheless, he was, you could say, a victim of anti-Semitism, as you will see later in his story. Very early on, when he was only 16, he was drafted into the German army and had to serve in the trenches of the First World War. You can imagine this was a horrendous experience for, well, for anybody, but especially for a young teenager. And it certainly left his mark on him. But you could say in another way, it toughened him up and it enabled him to survive the rigors of exile and internment, although in some ways it made him quite an angry and a bitter person sometimes. He survived intact, he wasn't wounded. And there's a whole other story about the artwork he produced in the First World War, which we haven't got time for now. And when he came back from army service, he enrolled at the Leipzig Academy of Graphic Arts and the Book Trade. Leipzig was the absolute center, not just in Germany, but in the whole of Europe for the book arts. There was publishing, but there was also printing, illustrating, there was typography and book design, and the 1920s were a very lively time for book collecting, bibliophiles, and so on. And that was Hellmuth's great passion. His father was also a lecturer at the same academy and was very interested in art education. So this went extremely well. He graduated and he was taken on, in fact, straight away to the teaching staff and became one of the Academy's very youngest professors there. As well as that, he had a flourishing freelance career. He made prints, that was his great strength, and he designed book plates for book collectors, and he had an exhibition of all of his art in Leipzig, and it was a really golden period in his life. He also found love. He fell in love with this woman. I don't know if you can see, I can't see myself on the screen. Here she is, she's Edith Halberstam. And she came from a very well-to-do Jewish family. They were extremely cultured. I know that they had a small Rembrandt in the family, and they had a very glittering social life. And unfortunately, the Halberstams didn't really think that Hellmuth was a suitable partner for their daughter, and that already right from the beginning created a lot of tension in their marriage, which was a very tempestuous one. And it has to be said that their son was born not that many months into the marriage, so it looks as though they had married somewhat in haste. And as I said, they had a tempestuous relationship. And then they married in 1931 and 1933. Of course, the Nazis came to power, and already life in Leipzig was affected. And eventually pressure was put upon Hellmuth, who now had a Jewish wife, to hand over the teaching of some of his subjects to a new Nazi deputy rector of the University of the Leipzig Academy. And Hellmuth was a staunch anti-Nazi and was absolutely furious at this invasion of his teaching. And in any case, by the end of 1938, his contract was not renewed, and he and two other members of staff who both had Jewish wives as well were all dismissed from the academy. Now, as I've said, he had a flourishing freelance career, and he'd already made a name for himself, not just in Germany, but in England too, and had several supporters and people who would act as guarantors for him and help him to find work. So England seemed an obvious place to come, and his English was not bad. He spoke other languages too. And at the end of 1938, he set off and finally arrived in Britain at the beginning of 1939 without, it has to be said, his wife and his child, who came later. And in fact, they didn't ever live together again. So all was well. He had, let's say, 9 months to work and build up his new freelance career until the outbreak of the war, September 1939. And then, of course, the tribunals about which we have heard much today. Perhaps we could look at his certificate, Monica.
So simple, it's just...
Next slide, I think, is
there we
there.
go.
There we go. Yes, just you can see, like many other people's certificates, that initially he was not thought to be a threat to the British government, and it wasn't until the internment crisis of June 1940 that he was rounded up and sent off to Warth Mills, about which we have just heard in great detail. He has an interview which is held at the Imperial War Museum, and he talks in great disgust, just like Peter Fleischmann, about the conditions in Warth Mills. He says, we were sometimes almost inches in water because there was no drainage, but the washing water taps were about a dozen for 2,000 people. So you can imagine what it was. And the cooking, you had to wait hours before you got anything to eat. So it was very depressing. Luckily, he wasn't there for too long and was soon was taken over to the Isle of Man, where he was installed in Hutchinson Camp, as Richard said, which became known as the artists' camp. Well, it wasn't only artists there, but many prominent artists, like, for example, Schwitters. And they were all moved, as you probably know, into guest houses. And Hellmuth Weissenborn was a very good cook, so he instantly volunteered to become the cook. And on the very first night, he cooked the always present herring. That's what they mostly had, herring, potatoes, and oatmeal. And it was in plentiful supply, unlike in some of the camps that Rachel mentioned. There was plenty of food. The diet was rather monotonous, but he managed to make the herring taste like trout, and it was a great success straight away. And he worked on the psychology of the inmates in his house. He noticed that some of them were desperately worried and that they hoarded food in their rooms, and he banned that. And he made them all come and eat a communal meal together and improved the atmosphere in the house. So it has to be said, there were sort of two aspects, I suppose, like all of the internees. There was, first of all, the dreadful, dreadful aspect. He hated being incarcerated, he hated the barbed wire. And he said, which is pretty strong stuff, he said that it was as bad as having to fight in the First World War. Because he was well connected, he knew a few people, he was allowed to go on a special excursion one day to the Manx Museum. But of course, he was accompanied by a guard with a bayonet, and he said, never again. He hated and resented the restriction on his freedom so much that he vowed not to go again. We've also heard that there were very bad communications. It was very, very difficult to get letters from your family, and so that you didn't know where they were, and the letters were censored in any case, and it made people feel very panicky. They didn't know what was going on, and they didn't know how long they would be here. He said he could have borne it had he known, if he was going to be there for 6 months, but it nearly drove him crazy, just the restriction again on his freedom. And worse was to come, as we'll hear in a minute. But he had been able to work. Let's look now at a slide that he did manage to make in Warth Mills. So it's a lino cut. He was able to take with him in internment some of his cutting tools to make prints, and a very few boxwood blocks, which is what you need to make woodcuts, but they soon ran out. And you see here, this one of the very few artworks made in Warth Mills. So then we move on to Hutchinson Camp, where he did a lot more work. And there we see an actual photograph of him in his rather Spartan room. But it was, of course, a great source of comfort to him that he was able to get on with work. As I said, he had his cutting tools with him, which were vital, but what they didn't have, for example, was ink to make the prints with. And Richard's already told about how they improvised. And to make the ink for the blocks, he used ground up pencil leads and margarine, apparently, until they had better supplies. And better supplies did arrive because they had a very sympathetic commander of the camp who could see that it was good for morale for the artists to be able to work, and he arranged for supplies to be delivered. And eventually it was possible for them to make very good work indeed, some of which you can see in Manx Museum or elsewhere, and the work was of very good quality indeed. So that was a source of comfort. The lectures, or the unofficial universities which have been alluded to, were also a source of comfort to Weissenborn, and he attended many of the lectures, and he famously painted a picture of the lawn with all the refugees bringing out their chairs from their boarding houses, their own chairs, and you can see that work in the Imperial War Museum as well. The Isle of Man was a fantastic place to network, and here he met Neo Khan, for example, who became a lifelong friend. He was mentioned in an earlier talk, and Tony mentioned Richard Friedenthal, who became also a lifelong friend. So this was very important, not just for work, but for friendships which outlasted the internment period by a long time. Can we see the next piece of work that he did? Yes, here, A Still Life in Hutchinson. It shows the kind of quite Spartan quality, I think, of life. And Hellmuth loved these details of English life, the fact that the chair looked slightly different from German chairs. Later, he was to become obsessed with English milk bottles because they were so exotic to him. But you can see that and it's not easy to make a lino cut or a wood cut. It takes a lot of work, but he produced nevertheless quite a few, and he took part in exhibitions on in the camp as well. Okay, on to the next one. Yes, this is a rather mixed experience. You can see here the camp with a rather grim angel. I don't know if you can make out the angel in the sky. And for this, the commander was rather upset at this piece of work and demanded to see Weissenborn and to ask if Weissenborn had intended to show a cloud of discontent hanging over the camp. But Weissenborn denied this and said, no, it was meant to be an angel. This was around Christmas time, and he did have to spend Christmas on the camp. But in fact, then immediately after this print was made, Weissenborn designed a Christmas card for the camp, which apparently, I haven't got a slide, but showed a much more positive looking angel and one which was more in the spirit of Christmas. So he just said that he was not intending to give a negative view of the camp. So apart from the actual incarceration, he thought that they were very well treated there and he had no complaints. There was a famous other art project that Weissenborn took part in, and it was completely his own idea, and it reverts back to Richard's point about them being very innovative. Because there was the fear of being bombed by the Germans, of course, while they were in internment, but in fact, no bombs did drop on the Isle of Man, but they were not to know that. There was blackout. And the blackout was not the normal thick black fabric that they had elsewhere, but they had hastily painted over the windows with blue paint. And they painted over the light bulbs in the guest houses with red paint. And so it made for a very dingy interior, especially to artists who wanted as much light as they could have. So Hellmuth went outside and he got his razor blade and he started to scratch on the blue paint on the windows. And being Weissenborn, he created scenes from Greek mythology on his own house. And they were much admired. And just one who was an art historian on the camp, Klaus Hinrichsen, wrote up a very, very favorable report of this enterprise for the camp newspaper. And it was such a success that a spokesman from a neighboring house, a house where Orthodox Jews were lodged, again, we've had talk of how some households were kosher, so it made sense for Orthodox Jews to live together. And one of the spokesmen from that house came out and asked Weissenborn to represent on their house scenes from the Bible. So Weissenborn went over to the Jewish house and scratched out scenes from the Old Testament onto their house as well. Just another example of the ingenuity and of the artistic opportunities of the time. Now we come to the most negative aspect really for poor Weissenborn while he was interned, because it was while he was in the camp that his wife served divorce papers on him. At that time, it was very difficult to have to find legal representation. The British authorities had many other things to do and said quite firmly they didn't want to get involved with the domestic affairs of refugees. So it was that Weissenborn had to deal with the whole divorce and separation from his wife and son, crucially, on his own. And it was a very, very sad episode indeed. When he came out, the divorce had already gone through. He did manage to see his son, who had only been 6 years old when he came to Britain. So he must have been about 8 or 9 by then. He did manage to see him a few more times, but during the war in around 1943, his wife Edith, or ex-wife by then, managed to take Florian, their son, to the United States. and from there to the Argentine, where she remarried. And so it was that Florian Weissenborn didn't actually see his father again until he was 17 years old. And because the wife had thought that the very hysterical and angry letters from Weissenborn would upset their son, she didn't pass any correspondence on to him. And as a result of this, he simply thought that his father had abandoned him. And it left him a very vulnerable person all his life, even though they did meet up again, as I said, when he was a teenager. And I'm quite sure also that it left its mark on Weissenborn. And if he hadn't been in internment when the divorce had happened, perhaps they could have worked out something perhaps more fair to both of them. So that was a very dark period in Weissenborn's life. However, next slide, please. Now, Weissenborn was released from internment around the new year of 1941, and he returned to London, but it was not the London that he'd left in June 1940. The city has been torn apart by the Blitz. So on the one hand, this was a great shock, but on the other hand, for an artist's eye, it was very interesting. There were views. There was a view here of St. Paul's that normally you could not see, and there were interesting views of buildings, but also interesting diagonal shots where pillars had fallen down and supports, and Weissenborn was fascinated by this and the opportunities it gave an artist. He wrote to MI5 and asked for a permit to visit the bomb sites and to make work, but it was turned down. And I'm afraid to say that Weissenborn disregarded this lack of a permit, and he sneaked onto the bomb sites. And what he did there was exactly what he'd done in the First World War. In the trenches, he made tiny, tiny sketches and then sent them home, and much later worked them up into prints. And he did the same here. He went onto the bomb site, made a small sketch, and then immediately went back home and worked them up into lino cuts and woodcuts. And here is one of his quite famous pictures of St. Paul's that you can see. I think we have now a bomb site print to come. There we are. And you can see it's this very graphic work, very dark shadows and some interesting diagonal lines, and this wonderful, to him wonderful, of course, not to the occupant, view of a house which is sliced apart. We've all seen that. And he represents it very accurately here. And this whole series of bomb site prints you can see in the Imperial War Museum. And I think they're a wonderful, it has this very fresh eye that many of the refugee artists had, looking at English life, and especially during wartime. So he finally then picked himself up again for perhaps the third time in his life. He was only still in his 40s, and he did find happiness again. He remarried, and with his second wife created a publishing company, and he also had a very successful freelance career, illustrated very many books for British and German writers both, and he created bookplates and all sorts of other things. But he also had an important and influential teaching career. That's also where he re-encountered Peter Fleischmann, Peter Midgley, and several other refugees. He taught at Ravensbourne College of Art, and he was a great influence on a whole generation of British artists who, in very moving testimonials, said how much this man had influenced them, giving to them his European culture and a different perspective on life. Thank you. And the final slide, I think, is the biography, just to say, yeah, this is one from his post-war life then, one of his many books, Road, Rails and Bridges. And I think the final slide then is the biography. If you're moved to read more about him, you can read in the biography.
There is one more slide, which I'll just put on for good measure, just to give you the link where you can find out about Hellmuth in relation to Warth Mills itself. Thank you very much, Anna. That was, again, absolutely fascinating. Let me stop sharing the screen. And just taking a look at the time, yes, we certainly have some time for questions. Alex, what have you got for us?
We have one question here from Diana who asks, I'm interested to know whether any of the internees at Warth Mills ended up on the Dinera, and if so, how many? I'm not sure if any of our speakers would know that.
Rachel, are you the one to answer that, or indeed Richard? Unmute, you need to unmute yourselves. That's it, Rachel. And Richard, likewise, just unmute yourself.
So it's the host is unmuting. If Richard's got something to say as well.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, do you want to go first, Richard?
No, you go on, Rachel.
So Diana, in answer to your question, yes, something did, because the 200 of the survivors who were deemed fit from the sinking of the Arendora Star, so they'd been rescued and they didn't have to be hospitalised. They were then put on the Dinera, and some of those individuals were from Warth Mills. Obviously not all of them, but some of them were. Richard, what were you going to?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, there was, and we kind of were able to work backwards. So predominantly it was Italians from Warth Mills who ended up on the Arendora Star and lost their lives in a lot of cases. We sort of worked backwards because there is although there's no sort of directory or register of names in relation to Warth Mills as a camp, I think those all seem to have been destroyed during or after the war. There is still in existence an embarkation record for the Arendora Star. So that lists where the most recent camp that people travel from to board the Arendora Star. And a lot of those were the camps that Rachel mentioned, as well as Warth Mills.
Just a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, you could use the chat function and send it to me. It's Alex Moz. While I'm waiting for others to come in, Richard, I had a question to ask you, which is, you mentioned how people in Bury are generally not very aware that there is this history at Warth Mill. I'm curious, have you done anything, or has anyone done any work to reach out to local schools? I could imagine, there'd be a lot of interest to know that there is, something, of interest related to the Nazi era right there, practically on their doorstep.
Yeah, it's part of the project because, as Monica said, the project was funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So as part of the project, we built into the activity plan, doing engagement events. And so we worked with schools and the local college to create their own artworks in response to learning about the internees at Warth Mills and conditions. So they did work to respond to that. And then that was all exhibited in the local sort of indoor shopping centre. So we put that in. But then likewise, we also worked with refugees who'd come to Bury in the last 2 or 3 years, and who in some cases come more recent than that and were learning English. So they did writing about their own experiences, having been introduced to Warth Mills and what this site represented in terms of the history of refugees coming to England.
Great. Another question here from Caroline Slifkin, who herself is a local artist, wonders, were there any women artists? I don't know if Anna or
Men's camp.
Yeah, I suppose it would apply to any of the camps.
I'll put it to Anna anyway, because there weren't any at Warth Mills. There were no women in Warth Mills. But
I think Monica is.
I think she meant. I think she meant generally. Yeah.
I think Monica is more likely. Can you hear me?
Shall I chip? Yes, I could chip in there.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, they're smaller in number, but partly that is because there were fewer women interned overall. And the artistic activity that one is aware of was indeed on the Isle of Man rather than in the transit camps in Russian and south of the island. I'm thinking in particular of an artist called Margareta Klopfleisch, who again, interesting enough, was not Jewish, but she was an ardent communist. and anti-fascist, ends up actually having a very traumatic time on the Isle of Man and producing a very, very poignant wood carving, which he then works up into a larger piece called Despair, which, you know, in itself is a great deal of a naked woman with her arms upraised in despair. There are also various others one might mention, Pamina Marenholz, for example, and Nonnenmacher. So yes, there's a whole story there. And indeed, I should just add that one thing I'm hoping to do later in the summer is to invite a gentleman called David Wertheim, who actually lives in Douglas now and is very much involved with the Russian Heritage Trust, which is investigating the history specifically of the women in internment, to give a talk, which undoubtedly will feature some
Very good. And another question from Nissan asks, were there any photographers amongst the residents?
Yeah.
The problem is that they weren't allowed to take photographs within the camp. So there are some collections of photographs from the camps, but they were mostly official photographs that were either taken by commandants. So Daniels in Hutchinson camp, for example, he took a lot of pictures that are deposited with Tate Britain, which gives us a lot of pictures of Hutchinson. And there are other official photographs that were taken by the photographers paid by the government to document these things. And you can find, again, files at National Archives in Kew and at Manx National Heritage on the Isle of Man, which actually I was meant to be there today, and obviously I'm not. But yeah, so we find that really the most accurate way of getting information about what these camps look like is through the art, which is why all of these images that you've seen today, I mean, it's amazing because they show what the camps physically look like, as well as obviously showing some of the emotive responses as well. But yes, very much dependent on the artwork in the camps for a full picture, although there are some photographs in existence as well.
Right. That's actually your mention of the National Archives is a good segue to this question that came in from Chris, who asks, how accessible are the tribunal cards in the National Archives for researching information about individual internees? And what other sources of information did you and Richard and Anna use for your research?
Well, the exciting thing about the records in the National Archives now is that for a very long time it was this sort of terrible microfiche version of the tribunal cards, and it was only a small selection that you could see. So even if you knew someone was interned, you couldn't necessarily find their cards. And within the last 18 months, suddenly the access has been given. So if you have a subscription to Ancestry.com or Find My Past, then you can actually search for the individual tribunal cards there. Now, these are still not 100% complete. They are very much more complete than they ever used to be. For some reason, some of the cards, as I've been to look at the original cards in Kew, and they're put into lots of subsets. So actually, some internees had more than one card because they might have had their original tribunal card, which is in one folder, and then they would have other paper copies showing if they were sent to Australia or to Canada, and various things like that. But even online, there are still physical copies of cards available in the National Archives, which are not available online, that haven't been digitized. And also on the online versions in most of the series, you can't see the backs of the cards. You can see the front, which gives you a lot of information. But if you actually go to Kew and request the physical file, you can often read the backs of those cards as well. So they are quite accessible if you sort of know where to look. They're part of a very, very big series of files that are part of the Home Office files. And of course, the Home Office files in general are a very great source for finding out sort of more of the things that happened. I think I can say that Anna, Richard and I have all been at the National Archives in Kew at some point, looking at various files. The Manx National Archives, the Manx National Heritage obviously holds a lot of very interesting materials, particularly looking at memoirs and stories and letters relating to internment, which really puts a particularly good personal touch to it, because really it's I mean, for me personally, I'm very interested in the experiences of, you know, how did this affect people. And of course the Imperial War Museum also has a large number of memoirs and letters and other related documents that you can request to go see.
But can you hear? Sorry. Is it worth saying that although it's, in my experience, it's okay to find the tribunal cards, but when you know somebody was interned, it isn't always possible to find them on any list. There's no proper, coherent, consistent, isn't that right? And you can write to the Isle of Man, they go, oh no, but we only have very sketchy records. So it's not a complete picture, is it? So
no, and I think that
it can be quite frustrating. I find
it is really frustrating, and I think that's an absolutely brilliant point, because and I think one of the challenges, of course, of researching this area is that the records are so incomplete that sometimes it's still completely impossible to trace anything. I mean, I've been researching this for well over a decade now, and I know from my research that my paternal grandfather was interned. He was a Viennese Jewish refugee who came across, and for the very first time in over a decade, this year I found his tribunal card in Kew. It is not available online, but it is available in Kew, and that was the first time I'd found any information. And I mean, I know certainly at Manx National Heritage, they often say that people say, well, you know, my father was interned, and they've never come across any records there. And yeah, it's very some people there's a lot of information about, and some people very difficult to find information about.
Rachel, am I also right in thinking that there's evidence that quite a lot of the records were actually physically destroyed, possibly under mysterious circumstances, or have I got that wrong?
Some of them were, yes. Well, and some of them, like some of the files, for example, relating to the Arandora Star, are listed in the catalogue, but if you request them, they have gone missing. Dare I say, in inverted commas. So yes, it's very much an incomplete thing. I just compiled. I was doing a sort of statistical analysis of the population of the camps, and it's just even that, you know, they have returns for everything, with the exception of a 6-week crucial periods where you have no idea where the internees have been moving. And I think the other important thing to note there is the fact that actually the worst records are from the very beginning of internment. So like with the transit camps and sort of with the initial chaos, it's hardest to find comprehensive material from that point. Once the camps are established and as the numbers are diminishing, that's when you start to find more files available, and then you'll find that there's a wealth of information, for example, from 1943, but that's completely irrelevant if you're looking at the majority of German and Austrian refugees.
Thank you. So much research, much more work, begging to be. Yes.
Can I just say something on that? I think the for our project, coming to it from a point of view of delivering a project like this, where we're not just looking at one person, I think it's very much the sort of richest archive came from families. Just looking through who's in the room, there's Chris and Andrea and Deborah, all had, relating to their ancestors, such rich kind of archive there that had been looked after and cared for, and then was shared, that I don't think you can underestimate that as well, encouraging people to share that and what kind of impact that can have on a project, because those are always the pieces that people connect with, because it tells a human story. It's not just statistical data. It's very much the human story that are in letters and written testimonies and things like that.
Absolutely. On the back of what Alex was saying earlier, it seems to me there's huge potential for other camps to be similarly investigated by the local communities. It's begging to be done in a way, isn't it? I feel we must stop. It's just gone 6:30. Thank you very much, everybody. participants and listeners in. Can I just end by saying there is more this week on internment. It's clearly a tremendously rich terrain that begs further scrutiny. But on Wednesday, there's going to be a talk which will pick up, I think, on many of the threads that have been begun today by Simon Parkin, who actually, as we speak, is working on a new book called The Island of Extraordinary Captives. Guess what he's talking about? It is, of course, the Isle of Man, and he's been going to be focusing specifically on Hutchinson as a so-called artist camp. So do subscribe, do sign in for that. It's at 5 o'clock on Wednesday. And then hard on the heels of that will be a very interesting talk specifically on music in internment with Norbert Mein, who will tell you more then about his wonderful project looking at music in the internment camps, among other things. So thank you very much. It's time to say goodbye. Many thanks.